there, my name's Anna Burley. I'm the Policy Officer for the Cooperative Party. For everybody who is looking forward to hearing from Baroness Glenys Thornton, my big apologies. She's been called away at the last minute and you are stuck with me instead, but hopefully I can do a good enough job and we'll be able to invite Glenys back at a future date. This evening, we are going to be talking about the cooperative movement's role through a second wave. So as the country braces for a second wave, and indeed as many parts of the country are already in local lockdowns, the co-op movement is poised to step up again. Just as we demonstrated our values through the first lockdown, helping to prevent hunger, support young people, tackle loneliness, enable people working from home, connecting communities up, we're going to hear about the role that the movement can play in the months to come. We've heard from lots of co-ops already through this conference. On Saturday, any of you who were able to join will have heard our session called Co-ops and COVID. We had a range of speakers with individual experiences of how their co-op project was making a difference through the first national lockdown. This included Councillor Eve Holt from Unicorn Co-op delivering groceries and other essentials by bike. Another great bike example, Nick Small in Liverpool set up a partnership between the council and a cycling co-op, Peloton. We had a fantastic member pioneer from the co-op group, Laura Newlands, up in Bath in Kilburney, who was organising volunteers to make face masks. Paula Hara from a drivers co-op in Cardiff, taxi co-op, offering discounted rides to the NHS. And Joanna, who helped develop a partnership between the council and Central England Co-op, getting food to people who couldn't leave the house. So real diversity of ways that the co-op movement stepped up, just a few examples there, and we'll be able to hear more examples today, I'm sure. But in addition to this, the co-op movement supported food justice through support to and running of food banks, community organisations. This was led by retail societies, but also encompassed many cooperative activists and co-op counsellors. So some really great partnership working emerging through 2020. We supported, the movement supported the shielding programme by delivering food led by retail societies, instigating many volunteer-led delivery services. In the case of the co-op group, and I'm sure Paul will touch on this, sort of more national systems as well. We had sort of co-op platforms created by the group again, cooperate.coop.co.uk, to help connect individuals excited about helping their neighbours and getting involved in mutual aid to take that forwards in a more long-term and sustained way. And we even had co-ops and social enterprise generating PPE, for example, 3D Crowd. So really impressive amount of contribution, and part of what we are talking about with Owning the Future is how we build on the positive contribution that the cooperative movement makes and make the case for why it's a better form of doing business. So that's what this session is going to look at. We're going to have a panel discussion with some expert speakers, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. If you would like to ask questions, we have a box to the right-hand side of the live stream on our website. You can type your Q&A there, and I'll come and be monitoring that throughout and come on to questions towards the end. So without any further ado, I will first introduce Paul Gerard, who's the Campaigns and Public Affairs Director at the Co-op Group. He's responsible for the co-op's relations and engagement with government, whether it's public affairs issues, leading campaigns on things like loneliness, slavery. He's also a trustee of the Cooperative Heritage Trust. And for those of you who watched Jim McMahon's excellent introduction on Saturday, will see that he went to the Rochdale Pioneers Museum to give his speech, which is managed by the charity, the Co-op Heritage Trust. So a really nice join up there. So I'll hand straight over to you, Paul, to hear a bit about the group, what you've been doing and what you're going to be doing next.
Certainly, and thank you very much for the invitation to join the panel this evening. As you said, I'm Paul Gerard. I'm Campaign Public Affairs Director at the Co-op Group. I've been there for almost 5 years now, having spent more than 20 years in the civil service. I've had precious little time in the last 7 months, in truth, for reflection. So preparing for this evening gave me some time to do that. So here goes. And I think what I will say, and you mentioned it there, Anna, I think what I will say in different ways, every single cooperative society up and down the country, as well as any other co-op, will have been doing similar or related things. I think the first thing I would say that we've done is throughout this crisis, my 58,000 colleagues in the cooperative group, whether it be in our shops, 2,700 of them, in the a dozen or so distribution centres that support not just those shops, but also 5,000 other independent retail shops, be the other independent cooperative societies, NISA, Cost Cutter, or it be my colleagues in funeral care homes. All those colleagues, those frontline colleagues, have really stepped up as key workers, and they've been heroes for this country. What they've done is mirrored, I know, by colleagues in other retail societies up and down the country, be it Mid-Counties, East of England, Southern, Scot Mid. And I do hope that the value that we now place as a country on them and the view that we have of them has changed, and changed for good. So they've been absolute heroes, and I think that's the first thing I would reflect on. The second thing, and beyond keeping our stores open and the shelves stacked so that people could be fed, is sort of three things that I'd highlight. Firstly, we provided resources, funding often, into communities up and down the country. And again, other cooperative societies will have done similar things, whether that funding be through the £4.5 million of funding we gave to 1,500 communities by the early payout of our local community fund in April. It could be the £1.5 million of products that we gave to FirstShare in the first 10 weeks of the crisis. Or the £2.5 million of airtime we gave. We pulled our Easter ad about Easter eggs and the like. We pulled it, gave the airtime that we paid for to FirstShare, and they produced a advert fronted by Marcus Rashford, MBE, as Marcus is now, to drive donations to FirstShare. Or it could be the £2.6 million we gave to schools in our Cooperative Academies Trust who hadn't been able to access the Edenred scheme, and we paid for the free school meals for those children that needed it over the summer Easter holidays. So resources have been a big thing that I think we've done, and I'll come back to that in a moment. The second thing we've done, and again you mentioned this, Anna, is I think we've helped to connect communities so that they can cooperate and support each other, be that through the thousands of people we've supported in our community shopping scheme, the tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people who've used our Cooperate platform. As Anna said, this is a digital platform that allows you to connect with people, and as physical social interactions become harder, that Cooperate platform has really come into its own. We launched that early so that we could help people. And the last thing, and I know you had one of them on the conference early in the week, the work of our hundreds of member pioneers has been absolutely critical. Every month, those member pioneers who are paid for by the group have spent around 20,000 hours every month working in communities, be that supporting vulnerable members, finding volunteers to help in communities, coordinating schemes, support children, or coordinating schemes to make scrubs for the NHS. Those member pioneers I think have been some of the unsung heroes within the cooperative movement. And certainly they've helped to, along with Cooperate, help to connect communities. And then the final thing, I think this is important for the cooperative movement particularly, is I think, and thinking of the cooperative value of solidarity, we've been using the voice we have as a big business, and the cooperative group is a big business, to be able to support those who may not have the platform and were suffering, or those who were trying to get the platform for those people. So two examples of that. We were the first business to support Marcus Rashford in his campaign on free school meals. We've been comfortably the most vocal supporter of Marcus throughout his campaign, both over the summer holidays and now in the task force he's created. And we continue to help him on a day-to-day basis, him and his team, to take that campaign forward. It was also our CEO, Steve Morrells, who was the first business CEO in the UK to call out the issues of racial inequality following George Floyd's murder in the States, which shone a light on the inequality in the UK, which are only becoming bigger during COVID. So I think be it resources, be it connecting community, be it using our voice to provide a platform for those who need it. I think those are the three things on reflection amongst the, you can group them in different ways, but those are the three ways I group them. And we can be very proud of those things. And we are very proud, and I am particularly proud of what we've done and what my colleagues have done. But I also then reflect on what we learned, and perhaps this will help for the conversation to follow. Three things. Firstly, cooperative businesses and enterprises are uniquely placed to support communities, because by definition, co-ops put value into the community. They don't take it out as PLCs and other particular business models do. Co-ops fill up the community, they don't drain it. I think that's a really important point, and how we position ourselves. Secondly, a part of the answer has to be resources and funding. We can't get away from that fact. And funding is important either to help co-ops grow or help social enterprises grow. And it's been critical for many in communities, and we can't get away from that. And so finding a way to reorientate our resources to those most in need, I think, will be a real challenge for us as we go forward. And thirdly, as the institutions of the state closed or failed or were overwhelmed, it was communities that came together. And communities coming together is cooperation at its most organic that has sustained people. And I think one of our challenges is how we find ways to make that organic cooperation scalable and sustainable for the future, because it's that cooperation, that organic form of cooperation, which I think has really shone through. I'll pause there, Anna, let other colleagues have their time and probably say much more things than me, but hopefully it provides some food for thought for the discussion later on.
Great, thank you. And obviously that sort of organic cooperation being brought to scale is how the group and other retail societies began. So, you know, recreating that at another time of great need is such an important call to action. So thank you for that, Paul. Our next speaker is Karen Creven. Karen is the Chief Executive of the Active Wellbeing Society, which is a cooperative in Birmingham, which works to help develop healthy, happy communities. So really ties in with some of the themes that Paul discussed there. They deliver a wide range of free activities and services aimed at improving wellbeing in an individual and community level. And a sort of a special shout out for Karen, because there's been all sorts of broadband troubles in Birmingham. She's gone to great efforts to join us. So I'll hand over to you, Karen, and thanks for being here.
Thank you very, very much for having me. It's a real pleasure to be able to come and talk to you. I want to just share the screen with you, if I may, put some slides up. I'm just going to talk about the work that we did in Birmingham. I'll just turn it into a presentation, but I guess we were just a quick bit of history about the Active Wellbeing Society. We were a council service that was spun out about 3 years ago, and we set ourselves up as a cooperative and a community benefit society. We're still young as cooperatives go, and we're still finding our way as a cooperative, and we're very much on a journey. But I think what the first lockdown certainly gave us an opportunity to do was lean into cooperative principles in practice at a time of real adversity. And so what I want to talk about is just an initiative that we were able to coordinate and hold for the city. It was a collaboration of a range of organisations across the city that came together to look at the immediate problems that were being thrown up for our disadvantaged communities. So I'm just going to give you as a flavour of some of the work, and you can see some of the people that supported and funded it along the bottom. One of the things that we were doing right across the city of Birmingham, 1.1 million people, was working in a range of ways with our most deprived citizens, usually around issues to do with physical activity and active citizenship. But as COVID hit, and as we became aware that things were going to massively change as we shut down, we lent into the intelligence that was coming from our communities and the collaborative work that we were doing with them, and we developed a whole new range of responses in response to the need that they were identifying. The first thing that hit us straight away was food and the need for food, and then more latterly, as the days turned into weeks, we looked at things around connections and around taking activities online for people who weren't digitally discriminated against. So that was the range of responses that collaboratively we came up with as #BrumTogether, a group of about 60 plus organisations. None of these things existed before COVID. What you can see here, we did monitoring. I mean, this is an underestimation, if I may be so bold to say. Not all of the organisations that we worked with had the capacity to return data, but where we could get data, that we managed to do some great insight on the back of it. And what you can see here is that there were over 11,000 requests. These were forms that people sent us online, and then there were over 13,000 calls. And the types of things that people were asking for help with was, like I was saying, food, and then there were other things that we were able to support them with around support and advice and other supplies. 78% of the requests that came in were from households within indices of multiple deprivation 1. So 78% of all the calls and forms that we received were from that deprivation quintile, even though the city average is 58%. So we were seeing we were seeing an overrepresentation of people from the most deprived quintile, those in the most need in the city. And then you can see that beneath that, 92% were from the top 40%. So we were really able to demonstrate that this was a service being taken up by the people who needed it most. And we were able to show that against the customer mosaic segments as well, which is what was another thing that we use a lot to check that we're reaching the right people. I'm going to whiz through these next slides, but I just want you to see the scale of some of the work that we were doing. 60,000 food parcels went out, nearly 20,000 cooked meals, and we also were providing food in collaboration with Birmingham City Council and FareShare. We were providing food to other food organisations, food banks and the like, who were then distributing themselves. So as well as staffing a central citywide food distribution hub for parcels, we were also getting bulk food out to other organisations so they could add to it. And this was all supported by FareShare, who gave well and above the food that they were contracted to. We took some of our activities online and carried on trying to engage with people online, and you can see the kinds of session reach that we were getting and the kind of views that we hit. I mean, 45,000 people watched for more than a minute. Which was amazing for us in terms of the penetration we'd had previously in terms of any virtual offer as a group of organisations. You can see there the kind of scale of support that we were doing over the phone for people who were feeling isolated and who felt that they needed support during the difficult time. And tier 1 is people who just referred themselves. Tiers 2 and 3 were people who were being referred by GPs or other professionals. Became evident partway through COVID that not just food was required, but people were needing clothes and other support. The system had shut down effectively in terms of charity shops and food and clothing relief. So we managed to work with other agencies, pull together a whole raft of donated clothes from streets and from organisations, sorted that all at Aston Villa Football Ground, which was a great experience for the people who were sorting out all the clothes. And then as you can see, we've been getting them out through the networks of organisations that we're involved with. You can see as well in Birmingham we have a free bike scheme, and 82 bikes were given to key workers. They were originally loaned, but they've all now kept their bikes. These were all people who were living in deprived communities themselves, but as key workers were eligible to be fast-tracked through for bikes. And you can see there the scale as well of volunteering that we had in the city. Now, all of this was underpinned by a cooperative and collaborative approach. We lent into the cooperative principles. We were informed by some complex system leadership around how to really work in this environment, and we wouldn't have been able to have achieved as much as we were able to if we hadn't worked in such a cooperative and collaborative way. You can see there some of the organisations that got involved throughout this, and I suppose as I draw it to a close, the learning for us as an organisation through this time was just how much the cooperative movement has to give communities when they organise in this way. So I totally echo Paul's earlier point about community organising at its best. And I think that there's loads more that we can do going into the next phase of lockdown to kind of further this work. And certainly one of the outcomes for Birmingham is that we've now got a food justice network established on the back of some of this work, committed to tackling food poverty in the city and providing sort of opportunities to grow local co-ops to sort out food resilience. So it's very exciting times, even though times of real adversity.
Great, thank you, Karen. And that's such an impressive story that you've got to tell. And like you say, at a time of huge challenge and personal challenge for all of the people who will have been involved, people were really motivated to help their neighbours too. And that's something that it is so impressive, but also that you're able to create something sort of that institutionalizes it afterwards so that we keep that momentum going. I think my third speaker is Jo White. Jo is the Executive Director of Co-op Futures, a cooperative development agency, and until 2018 she was long-standing Director and Trustee of Cooperative and Community Finance, serving as their chair, and also spent time serving on the board of Co-ops UK. So a real co-op expert here for us to talk maybe a bit about what you've experienced through lockdown of the movement doing and where you think it might take us next. Are you there, Jo? Ah, there we are.
Yes,
I'm perfect. Here. Lovely, thank you.
Okay. It's always slightly concerning when you're introduced as a cooperative expert. I don't think one such thing exists. There's always so much to learn. I'm Jo White, as explained, and for the last 20 years I've been working with cooperatives who are looking to either set themselves up or to grow or to develop. And so, you know, it's great and it's fascinating to see the range of different types of cooperatives that exist. And I think that was really demonstrated as we went into lockdown the first time. It was, the response from the cooperative movement was phenomenal, and really was phenomenal. I mean, the whole first lockdown, it really highlighted issues such as food poverty and isolation that members of our communities were really suffering with. And the movement stepped up. It really stepped up, from retail societies supporting people with providing food and supporting, working with food banks, to organisations like Karen, who did a phenomenal job around bringing everybody together, you know, across Birmingham, from councils, you know, the Co-op Councils Innovation Network. Their members certainly did a lot of work around putting in place emergency responses with co-op values and principles put in the heart of them. And then we had the sort of the smaller, much smaller co-ops who really took their local communities and found out what they needed and how they worked for them. And we saw a whole range of activities happening there. Most co-ops really turned themselves into some form of community hub from where all the emergency responses and support could be delivered from. Everything from sort of community-owned shops, community-owned pubs. I mean, although pubs were made to shut, they still continued to deliver services into their communities. Through to organisations like Kitty's Laundrette in Liverpool, who provided free delivery services for the elderly and vulnerable who may be shielding and took and delivered. And equally, you know, were able to offer free service to those in financial difficulties. So there was a real breadth of response, and I think every co-op looked at itself and said, what can I do? What is it that we've got that we can deliver for our communities? And it was the speed with which we responded, which I think was amazing. And I think that's one of the things that we as a movement have real opportunities with. We can be flexible, we can be adaptable, and we can make decisions and move with speed. And I think that was really, really important to our communities. One of the other things I would sort of say about it is we are at our most effective when we learn from each other and we sort of come together to share our experiences and learn. When I was sort of thinking about what to say this evening, I'm very aware that, you know, we're all looking at, it is inevitable that we're all heading for some form of lockdown, be it local, be it regional, be it, I mean, just picked up a bit before I started the conference, that university students being put into a sort of a lockdown of their own. You know, will it be a circuit breaker? We just don't know. And I think that's one of the challenges we've got with the second round, is that there is so much uncertainty and actually division around what we will see this time. First time, we all felt like we were in it together, whereas actually now it feels more that we're being pitted against each other. And I think we were fantastic first time round, and I think everything we did first time round we will be able to pull out of the hat at a moment's notice and replicate. Might not be easy, might not get very much sleep while we're doing it, but we will be able to do it. But I think second time round we're looking at something quite different, and I think some of the challenges we will face will be quite different. And right up there is the issues around well-being, mental health and isolation. We are weary. And so we as a movement, I think, need to start to think about how can we help those communities and those individuals in those communities to deal with those challenges. So we need to play to our strengths, and we have a lot of them. And both Paul and Karen have sort of described co-ops, you know, at their best when they're community organising. So if we use our strengths, we've got a whole number of people People are members of co-ops because they believe in cooperation and they want to go out and they want to cooperate with people. And that is our biggest strength and our biggest asset. We're trusted. On the whole, some of those organisations who work in small communities are the most trusted organisations there. And throughout the first lockdown, we were able to reach out to even more people. And thirdly, on a slightly more practical level, is we have assets. We have buildings, we have spaces, we have all sorts of things that we need to think about. How can we use those creatively to support communities around wellbeing? Because I do think that will be the biggest challenge. But in terms of the movement, Principle 6, cooperation amongst cooperatives. We are at our best when we're working together, and I think some of that was demonstrated during the first lockdown. Community pubs came together, they had a network where they were able to share what they were doing, experiences, what worked, what didn't work, so that other pubs were able to pick it up and run with it. Community shops, they struggled at one point with access to suppliers, and I know that some of the big retail societies and the Plunkett Foundation all came in and created that campaign and managed to make sure they were still getting supplies. The Co-op Councils Innovation Network, they've just released a report on cooperation through COVID-19, which talks about some of the work that they've done. And I think one of the things we can do now in preparation is to promote some of those things that we've been doing so that other people can replicate and learn from them. So as I say, I think our response has been phenomenal. Unfortunately, I think there's more to go.
Thank you very much, Jo. And I think that point about sort of cooperatives working together, and also some of the examples we've seen of cooperatives and councils working together and credit unions joining up with workplaces to be able to create a much more joined up response is such an important one, and a theme that keeps coming back. So you're quite right to raise it. So I'm really excited to invite our final speaker of this panel to speak. Stella Creasy is one of our fabulous Labour and Cooperative MPs up in Walthamstow, so the opposite end of the Victoria line to me. Before being an MP, Stella's worked in think tanks for Labour ministers, for the Scout Association, as well as being a councillor and serving as Walthamstow's mayor. She served on the front bench as a Shadow Minister for Crime Prevention and also Business, Innovation and Skills. And a big congratulations to Stella. She's the newly elected London representative on our NEC. So thank you so much for joining us, Stella. Anyone who follows Stella will have seen that there's a vast amount of community action happening in Walthamstow. So I'm really keen to get your input on this topic.
Thank you, Anna. It's a rare thing for Walthamstow to be described as the North. But obviously from where you are in South London, maybe we finally are the Wall. And thank you very much for inviting me to be part of a discussion. It is hugely inspiring to hear what Paul and Karen and Jo have been talking about, and to reflect on how, when something like a pandemic hits our country, the co-op movement has not just stepped up, it stood up, lived its values and made a practical and meaningful difference to millions of people in this country, at a time when many people were questioning whether collective action was something people would be part of. I'm hugely proud. I want to try and do that unusual thing in a panel of 4 people and not repeat what the last 3 people have just said, because I thought it was such a brilliant explanation, particularly in terms of the co-op pioneers and Karen's very lived example in Birmingham, and also Jo's reflections, but to try and pick up what Jo had talked about in terms of what happens next, and in particular, frankly, the fatigue that people now feel about cooperative activism within their communities because of the pandemic. Because I think we have to reflect and recognise that the last 7 months have been extraordinarily draining and frightening and emotionally disturbing for many of us, because to live through something like a pandemic is something none of us ever thought that we would do. If I reflect, as Anna said rightly, on the cooperative work that we've undertaken in Walthamstow in the last 7 months in response to the pandemic, I have to say, I just have to share with you, obviously I was actually on maternity leave when in March, when first the realisation of quite what was happening with coronavirus happened, and I had a locum, a fantastic woman called Kizzy Gardner, who, in fairness to her, had already dealt with a general election as a locum cover MP, so really had done her dues of unusual experiences. And I rang her and said, look, I think this is very serious. We're going to have to mobilise in the community. And the one thing both of us knew was, although it was an incredibly frightening thing to face a pandemic, because of the links, because of the relationships, because of the spirit of cooperatism within Walthamstow, we knew we could face head on what was coming. And in the last 7 months, I've been overwhelmed by the way in which my community, working with co-op movements locally, has responded to the pandemic, whether in terms of organising around food banks or organising around medicine access for people, but also in terms of mental health. And then on a very practical basis, as a local member of parliament, organising volunteers to help and support the work that we were doing, trying to understand what was happening in our community and trying to support some of those very vulnerable people dealing with the concept of shielding. And I think the reflection for me, as I look now at the possibility not just of a second lockdown, but of intermittent lockdowns, I think is the best way to describe it, is of having to request of people the very best that they have expressed themselves over the last 7 months on a repeated way, and what that might mean. And I thought Karen's slides were so good at expressing how part of that is about helping people understand that in a crisis moment, we don't just have each other, we get the best out of each other. And that in itself is a healing process, because it helps address some of that concern that people have in this current times, that a pandemic is a great leveler. And I think what's really powerful about the last 7 months for us as a co-op movement is how the values that we have always known have been at the heart of the very best of this country and the best of progress in this country have come to the fore. Now, what does that mean for us in practice with that second lockdown and those intermittent lockdowns, probably well into the next year? It means that we have to look at how we can continue to motivate people, but we can do that from a perspective of shared knowledge. And I think Joe was very right about how we should be sharing those examples and sharing people's practical realization, because of course in March, many of us were putting together those cooperative networks of people in our local communities at short notice, on the fly, through the networks that we had. Now we have some structures, and now we have the ability to coordinate and organise with our co-op partners at a national level. I think our ability to champion the idea of cooperativism as the answer to how we get through these coming months is even stronger. But I also want to share with you one of the examples of where I think we have more to go. And it was something that we were working on in my local community, and I'm sure across the country, was of course, co-op businesses didn't fit the mould of what the Treasury was wanting to support. So we were having to fight for them to be able to be eligible for the local authority grants to keep many of those going. To give one example, shared workspaces were simply not something that the local authority system was set up to support. And it was very striking to me that many of my local co-ops, I have some fantastic co-ops making beer. So if you ever come this part of London, do come for a pint. But we were trying to fight for them to be recognised to fit the models that the government had at a point of extreme crisis. So the first point for me now is, as we head into a second lockdown and series of lockdowns, we come forewarned and forearmed that we know cooperativism might be the answer, but we also know that the government as yet simply doesn't realise how powerful it can be, and as a consequence can do things that actually mitigate against our ability to cooperate. So a frustration for me was having to work with small business support at a time when I wanted them to some they could be. We head into a second set of lockdowns, and as we look at the that needs to be available, we have to be very muscular about the importance of recognising the co-op model and not seeing us being excluded by default as we were in the first set of lockdowns. I think the second lesson for me is one of the opportunity that comes from the fact that 4,000 co-ops were set up in the last 7 months in this country. They were called mutual aid groups, and there is increasing research about the power and potency of these organisations to have helped in their local community, alongside the more formal structures of volunteering, whether through the NHS or indeed through existing co-ops. We know that hundreds of thousands of people in this country are in essentially co-op activism over the last 7 months. The challenge for us is that those people didn't necessarily see themselves as explicitly being part of the co-op movement. And I believe there is a real opportunity in the coming months to reach out to those people and bring them into the work that we do and share with them the expertise that we have to help them continue to do their work and address that question of cooperative fatigue that I think people are now facing about the work they were doing in their local areas. What does that mean for us in practice? Well, one of the strengths of the co-op movement, why I've always been proud to be a co-op as well as Labour MP, is we've always been very practical. We've helped people understand how to organise. It's not just about a spreadsheet, it's about a set of principles and shared values, how you treat people, how you combine your resources, how you ask less of more people so that more gets done. And I think one of the very practical things that we can do in the coming months is to be that resource. And both Karen and Paul were talking about assets. I think our assets are our people who have that expertise as well, alongside the physical aspects of buildings and logistics, of how you actually help people to be involved, how you keep people going, how you motivate people, how you do organise with them. I have a real concern on a very practical level. All those wonderful mutual aid groups who've done brilliant things in their local communities, completely unsung about the impact that it's made, might devolve into being kind of WhatsApp groups of people arguing about parking on their roads. I think us as a co-op movement have a real opportunity to reach out and say, as we head into this new set of lockdowns, let us be part of your co-op. Let us work with you to link you in, not just to the co-op movement, to the wider co-op party and to those co-op principles to help you keep going and help you in your communities. In order to do that, and I think this is the final challenge that we face, we have to recognise that if we want to be part of building back better and building that co-op principle within the country and linking up all the work, so the co-op pioneers to the mutual aid groups, to show the fabric of British society is rooted in these values, we have to be able to be British. And it is a challenge for us as a movement at the moment that sometimes our most active people do not necessarily reflect the activism within our country. And how do we connect and interact with people from a range of organisations, from a range of backgrounds, to be a truly diverse movement that draws upon all those talents and all those experiences. So I think there are challenges for us. The great news, as far as I'm concerned, albeit with the horror of having to go back into a second lockdown, is that we do now have models, experiences, examples, as Karen shows so brilliantly, of what we can do, that we can use to show people that this is not just theoretical, it delivers. The working in a co-op way delivers real positive change in the face of the most extreme pressure any community or country could face, which is what coronavirus has become. A literally life or death scenario. It's been our movement that has helped mobilize people and marshal people to defend their communities and support them through this, and can be a solution, can be an answer for the coming months as well as the coming years, if we are able to reach out to those thousands of people who are doing what we do and link in with them and show them that our movement is their movement too. I'm very excited to hear what people might have to say about how we can do that and examples from your communities, because we can all learn from each other. But I also believe we have to recognise for ourselves, those are the challenges that we face if we want the co-op movement to be what we've always upheld it to be, which is the answer to that challenge of inequality. And coronavirus is like a magnifying glass on the inequalities in our society. We know that that pressure is going to come to bear. We know we have the answers. The question is, can we live our values to connect with people to make that happen for another 7 months?
Great, thank you. And that was a hugely inspiring and upbeat way to sort of move into our question and answer. So don't forget that if you would like to ask a question, we've got a typing panel on the right-hand side of the live stream, and I will try and get through as many as possible. But equally, as Stella mentioned, if you've got examples of something you think has been amazing in your area, then send them through, and we'd love to be able to hear them and share them with others. So I think the first one I will ask is actually 2 questions, but they're quite similar. Matthew Snape from Gateshead says, the Pioneers and Brum Together both have stories to share about the cooperative principles in practice. The story of how cooperators help their communities can be invisible outside the movement. How do we get these stories out, not in flashy stats and graphics, but plain English for every household? I think that's quite similar to Asim, who says, how do we get all the COVID support groups across the country who are cooperating but don't know that they're cooperators, and how do we recruit them to our movement? So it's a bit of how do we explain what a co-op is and let everybody who is a cooperator unknowingly know what a great movement they've joined and become part of. Maybe if I go in reverse order, and you're on my screen at the moment, Stella, so if we start with you, if that's okay, and then I'll work backwards through our panelists on how we communicate some of this.
So I think Matthew and Asif have absolutely hit on that challenge for us, because we have been that hidden gem in the cooperative response to this crisis. And as I said when I was talking, I feel very strongly that we have so much to give to those people who are, yes, again, to be called on by their communities to be part of the solution. For me, Matthew, the answer is, you're right, it's not so much about flashy gossip. I do think technology plays a part in this. I mean, I might joke about the WhatsApp groups of people arguing about their parking, but it's undoubtedly true that a lot of the organising and community spirit we've been able to engender in this country has been helped on the whole, not always. I think some of us on Facebook, where maybe we have thought perhaps it is better that we have a period of social distancing online as well, but have brought people in. And I think the best way is through the street. There are people, people I meet in the co-op movement. I mean, gosh, if I could persuade Karen to move to Walthamstow, I'd do a heartbeat and have her come and organise in my local community. As I say, we've got a very good co-op beer, Karen, I'm just saying. Joe and Paul too. People are our strongest. I think telling the very practical stories, and we talk in very big picture issues, but sometimes it is very practical things. How do you manage lots of people wanting? It's a very simple question within the co-op. And for a lot of people, so the first thing they've had to deal with is suddenly you've got a lot of requests and a lot of demands. So how do you logistically cope with things? How do you make sure that you don't burn people out? Because you are all issues through the years, and we have a tremendous amount of very practical, almost micro experience that I think we could be sharing. So certainly I'd line ourselves up almost as the work to the mutual aid groups, asking our co-op members to go out and proactively join their mutual aid groups in their local communities if they haven't already, person who is a point person for the expertise the co-op movement can offer about how to cooperate. Because on a very practical basis, we've all been person, and particularly if we're involved in political movements as well, who's made the mistake of turning up in a room and left the secretary with a large pile of leaflets and obligations and not really any support about how to do it. And what I thought was so brilliant about some of the presentations we've had today is if you hear those examples, you think, well, I want to be part of that. That sounds fantastic. And it also sounds manageable with real life. And I think telling those stories about how we've helped people combine real life for real practical outcomes, connecting into their co-op stores, is the way forward. And maybe a bit of flashy graphics to make that real for people as well.
Great, thank you. So that is a call for our P5 education for everybody. If you're not part of your mutual aid group and you can join and let everybody know about co-op values and how to make it a more substantial contribution, then do. You've heard it here first. Joe, can I come to you next? So that communication piece, lovely.
Hi. It's always the challenge, isn't it? How do we tell people about co-ops? Because we either have this very old-fashioned sort of image that we're your granny's divvy, or that or we're invisible. And I just really want to reiterate what Stella said. It's about people's lived experiences, and there is no stronger way to tell the story than to hear it from somebody else. I think sometimes we tie ourselves in knots in the language that we use, but I think that when we talk to people, and it's been mentioned a number of times this evening already, our strength is our people, and our people talk to you. You're not a co-operator if you can't talk, or perhaps I should say all co-operators can talk ad nauseum about co-ops. So, we need to be out there talking to people and telling them, but explaining that it's a cooperative. And I think we're not very good at that. Sometimes we're quite shy about that fact, or we start to explain it in a very technical way and you've lost them. But it's about telling people about how those values have kind of what difference they've made. And I think, yes, we all love a good flashy graphic, and there's nobody who likes a graph created from a spreadsheet more than I do, but it doesn't always mean something to everybody. So I think we need a combination, and we need those bigger organizations with a greater reach to be able to explain about the movement as a whole. And I think sometimes we miss that. And I think that mix of messages is really important.
Great, thank you. Karen, you've done a lot of that practical sort of communicating in order to engage people in Birmingham. What do you think has worked best in terms of recruiting people to our movement?
I think for me, I would say getting alongside people, doing it with them, and then reflecting their stories back at them, and then framing that within the cooperative movement. You know, for most of the people we work with, word of mouth from a trusted source is how they'll choose to hear the messages best. We know that that's what's most effective. So getting in alongside our communities, having something of value to offer them while we start the conversation about what we are and what we're doing, and understanding them. I think that's been really important for us. I mean, there's just a theme for me here, really, which is about recognizing the stories we need to tell, and then all of us having responsibility as the storytellers, because we're all a trusted source to somebody. So if we can, as Joe, as Joe was saying, there's something, isn't there, about being able to articulate what for everybody else what cooperatives are, but doing that in a way that means something to the audience. So starting with the value that they have, really, and being alongside them. That's what's working for the way we're working cooperatively in Birmingham, I would argue.
Great, and now over to Paul, who your day job is all about communicating what the co-op group is doing, and there's been a huge amount of work over the last few years, especially around your brand and communicating the co-op values, and really sort of talking about what it means to be a co-op, and some of those campaigning bits of work you've been doing. What do you think has worked in terms of bringing people in and understanding why the co-op is different to other supermarkets?
So I agree with almost everything that's been said. With one exception, and this is quite dangerous actually. So I'll disagree with Joe, because Joe said we can be quite shy. I don't think we can be shy. I think we can be very practical. We're more interested in getting the job done than we are about talking about it. And I think the thing that we don't do well is we don't use the assets that we have to really talk about the difference here is cooperation. The difference here is the values that drive our action, be it solidarity or equality or democracy. And actually, I think, I work for the Co-op Group, and I'm hugely proud of some of the things we've done on slavery and loneliness and now crime in communities. But actually, if you walked into our stores, would the words and the music match? Would you go in and say, oh, I realise that, for most people, the co-op will be the store, will be the local shop, be it a Co-op Group or Mid-Counties or East of England or Southern. And I just wonder whether we need to do a bit more, thinking of Principle 5, about saying the reason we can do these things is we're a co-op. The reason we've been able to set up mutual aid groups that Stella described is because we're a co-op. The reason we've been able to create Bright Future in Slavery to help slavery survivors is because we're a co-op. And I think that's the bit that, if I'm honest, I think the big institutions in the movement, particularly my own co-op group, but all our big retail businesses, I don't think we do enough of that. I don't think we put it front and centre enough. And I think that's a challenge for us.
Great, thank you. And someone's put a suggestion while we've been talking that we need co-op TV to talk about co-ops. I'm not sure that would necessarily reach beyond sort of members of staff, elected representatives, and die-hard cooperators, but I like it. So we've had another question, which is a bit about that sort of keeping people engaged, and I think it was it Stella, you mentioned that there's the risk of people burning out when you sort of do all at once and then can't keep it up. One person has said in some areas mutual aid groups were very successful, but in others they fell apart quite quickly. How do we ensure that this time mutual aid is more effectively and sustainably organised? And there was another one that said, lots of people in my area got involved during lockdown, but during the summer people disengaged as things opened up and the weather was nice. People might get back on board during a second wave, but how do we keep people involved once the crisis is truly over? So how do we make sure that cooperation is sort of for life, not just for Christmas, as it were? Did it work going sort of one way and then the other, like a xylophone? If I hand over to you, Paul, to start about, and I would be really interested if you could talk a little bit more about the platform that you've been creating in order to try and make some of this become more sustainable.
Yeah, I mean, I think enthusiasm and the desire to help will get you so far, but I think there is that risk of burnout, which is why I think the Co-operative platform. So the Co-operative platform is a digital platform that is locally based in the sense, and you can go on the platform and find people who want to do the things that you want to do, or the causes that you want to do, or fundraise for, or advocate for the issues that you want to talk about. So I think that Co-operate platform as an example is a good one. I think the member pioneers and the similar structures in, I know mid counties have them and southern have them. I think that kind of infrastructure can help as some of the enthusiasm might wane. I think you've got to have a bit of infrastructure. You know, I'm an ex-civil servant. I love a bit of structure. I love a bit of a bit of admin and a bit of bureaucracy, because actually it works. It can you know, inspiration and enthusiasm will get you so far, and then you need that bit of structure. So I think things like Co-operate, things like the member pioneers that we have, they can help sustain that cooperation and make it sustainable. And I think that's the bit that I would say it's the support that we can give to those local groups from the movement to help them over the rough bits.
Great, thank you. And Karen, how do you, you've clearly been really successful in creating some sustainable outcomes from the burst of cooperation we saw towards the start of March. How do you think that will pan out over in the long term?
Well, thank you. I suppose we're trying to straddle now that shift from an emergency response into looking at what can be much more sustainable, and then what will be flexible enough going forward. And I think about this a lot in terms of edge of chaos and organisational development. I know we're talking about communities and community responses, but it's applicable. You know, there's a point when you're innovating, when you're coming up with something new, where you've got to be on the edge of chaos. You know, you've got to allow anything to be on the table, but you've also not got to stay focused on what you're trying to achieve. And I think the mutual aid groups that you know, that we were working with, some of the ones that never got past chaos were the ones that fell away again, where they couldn't find a shared purpose, or actually the need that they were wanting to meet wasn't the need that there was. There's a tendency, I think, by the system to try and pull it into bureaucracy and to become, you know, part of the city's governance or part of the way that we always do things. And the sacrifice for that can be some of the ability to innovate in response to what's coming. So I think one of the things that we're desperately trying to do in Birmingham is kind of hold the successes, you know, set some systems and processes up behind the chaos so that we're edge of chaos and not right in the chaos, but stay flexible enough, because we still don't quite know what the local lockdown seeping into what's probably going to be a national lockdown, how that's really going to play out around poverty and around food need and around some of the other issues. I don't mean to compare them, but actually in a way, looking back, it was easier last time when we just got all thrown in it together. Yeah, this kind of slide into it is really uncomfortable. So we need to stay able to innovate. And that does mean actually that sometimes people fall away while they go and have a rest. But as long as somebody's holding the infrastructure in the middle, and with Paul about the need for some bureaucracy, because as long as we're holding the space on a central response, people can join back in then as they're ready with a fresh perspective and a bit more energy. And I think that's really important as well.
Great, thank you. And as someone who spends sort of outside of my day job involved in sort of community bureaucracy as a local councillor, I agree that actually sometimes that coordination helps people come in and out to suit the rest of their life and creates a much more sustained response for the people at the receiving end. Jo, can I pass to you to have a think about how we can sort of maintain some of this momentum?
It's always difficult when you come further down the line, isn't it, in terms of saying what you knew, what you want to say. But you know, I think I would sort of reiterate some of the things that Karen said about, you know, people did get tired, people needed to look after themselves, and in some ways we have needed, after that massive response, to kind of sort of rest inside ourselves and take some space. But people will come back, and I do find that once you're in, I'm afraid, you know, that's it. You're never getting out again. Once you're in co-ops, you're in co-ops, and there's no escape, however hard you try. And I do think people, when they've had a chance to recharge their batteries, they will come back. It will never be the same again. That whole shock lockdown was a shock to the system, and we've almost got this as Karen says, this sort of creeping, well, am I in, am I out? You know, you have to check on the BBC website as to what lockdown I've got today. So we don't, and that I think is more difficult around the uncertainties that we're all facing. I don't think we've lost people. I think they will come back, but we need to give them things to do. People don't want to sit and kind of feel, well, I've turned up and there's nothing to do. We need to work with people from where they are rather than where we want them to be. And so, you know, it'll be a slow burn, I think. At the moment, we're all dealing with just kind of what's right in the front of our face, and we just need to give it some space. I think that's sort of my feeling for it. But we do need to give them something to come back to, and I think that's where the skills and the experience of bigger co-ops and smaller co-ops can really provide support.
Brilliant. And as Stella said earlier, if we don't give people things to do, then WhatsApp chats can descend into discussions of parking, which I know all too well. Stella, what's your view on how we maintain that momentum and keep people involved in the long term?
Yeah, look, I think.
Oh, I've lost you slightly.
No, am I there?
It's breaking up a little bit.
Oh.
Give it a go. It's usually quite good at recalibrating itself.
Hopefully you can hear me. I'm impressed in terms of what Paul and Karen and Joe were saying. Oh no, I've stopped.
It's all right. I will, when your face unfreezes, I'll make sure we come back to you for proper closing remarks. I was going to have a sort of a final question, which I think could be answered in the round, Stella, when we get back to you. And I'm going to let Joe go first because it's been very cruel letting you go after people every time and running out of things. So it's sort of two quite nicely linked questions, and maybe tie this in with your closing remarks so I can let everyone get home for their tea. So one, Carly says, what hasn't the co-op movement done so far that we could be doing? So, you know, where are the gaps and what should the co-op movement be doing to fill them? And then Sharon says, the last major health pandemic was over 100 years ago. What legacy from this pandemic would you like to leave for those tackling one in 100 years time? Sharon, I hope there isn't a pandemic in 100 years time or ever, but you know, what in 100 years do we want people to reflect on in terms of the contribution of the movement? So Joe, if you want to, I'll put you on the spot to go first. It looks like Stella might have returned, so we'll come to you next, okay?
Two very small questions then. Now we'll just knock those out very, very quickly. What have we done so far that we could have done better? Was that the question, really?
Basically, well, you know, yeah. What haven't we done that we should have done or that we can do next?
Haven't we done that we should have done?
Or what could we learn from and do better next time? You know, if there are things that we tried, quite rightly, it was the first time we tried them, but actually a bit more thought and opportunity to reflect will help us do it better next time. Or maybe we, you know, the movement's really excelled and there's no gaps, but that's, as you say, you're never an expert completely, and
no,
that's never the case.
Right first time.
No, exactly.
Sadly, we might have a second time. Yeah. What could we have done better? What could we leave behind? I think we have an opportunity to, I think what's the legacy is we've talked a lot about, you know, everything you read says people don't want to go back to the way we were, and to some extent we need to move quickly to seize that opportunity, the whole build back better. I think what we need to do is to take some time, and I think maybe that's where we haven't started yet, is to actually embed the good things that have happened, and you know, to be able to make sure we hang on to them and don't lose them. You know, I think there's a danger that we've gone from, isn't it, you know, we've cut pollution, but now everybody's getting back in their cars. You know, some of those things, what could we have done to embed those better in where we go forward? So I think that's not a particularly good answer, but I kind of feel that's where we need to be thinking. We need now to be looking ahead. We've done the emergency response. We need to start to leave its legacy of the things that the movement can do.
Great, thank you. And Stella, welcome back. Sorry for cutting away. It's sometimes best just to take a moment. So if, in case you missed it, that last question, as well as sort of talking about how we keep people engaged, is also, A, when we look back in 100 years' time, what do we want the legacy of the co-op movement to be? And B, what didn't the movement do, or what did the movement do sort of in a great emergency response, but could do better if called upon to do so again?
Yes, I mean, I think all of us hope that if there is a second lockdown, our internet connections can cope with it, because I think all of us are finding that the challenge. And in answering your questions, I hope I can come at also something I feel like we need a little bit of confidence on the ground. So I want to disagree slightly with what Paul had said, just about the needing to provide structure, because I think actually what the co-op movement could do that maybe we didn't do this time round is defend networks and defend giving real power to people. I think there is a tendency, and we've all seen it in some local areas, to kind of think, well, we need to standardize everything because that's how we protect from risk. And so actually sometimes you miss out on volunteers, you miss out on communities who maybe work in different ways because they don't fit that kind of pro forma approach. And I was thinking about what we did locally and the role I was playing, essentially as an MP. As a co-op MP, I often end up playing a kind of brokerage role about fitting people to outcomes rather than necessarily fitting people to structures. Because we all know people in our local communities who are great lodestars for change, who can mobilise. I have a fantastic ex-Australian Army general who organised 3 of our mutual aid groups because they were all far too frightened to say no to her about a number of things. She didn't fit into the local authority structures because it didn't work for her. And I think one of the things that we can do better is to be clear about what role people can and also cannot play. One of the things I think the mutual aid groups did so very well that actually the co-op movement I think could tap into is supporting people's mental health. And I don't think we've really talked enough about the mental health impacts of the first lockdown, the ongoing, and this is not necessarily about people having mental health problems, but about the loneliness, the isolation, the sense of fear about what might happen, about saying to people it's okay not to be okay because you're also not on your own. And I think one of the things that the mutual aid groups and those informal networks did so well was to help people have a sense in their communities that they were with other people, which is different from the logistics of organising food deliveries or organising people to get their medicine, or organising through co-op stores to get particular outs to give to people who were shielding. I would contrast that with, so one of the things that my local mutual aid groups did, and we worked quite hard, and we ended up doing it with the Salvation Army, and I would hope that the co-op movement maybe could play this next role, was partly because we don't have a credit union at the moment, was working at how volunteers could exchange money without actually having to exchange money. So when you had somebody shielding, how could you make sure they got food that was paid for by that person who couldn't use an online shopping system? And if in the end our Salvation Army came out with quite a complicated system, I think as a co-op movement, we could fill some of those gaps about the things that actually we shouldn't be asking volunteers to do. Again, when we were coming across people who did have child protection concerns, very real, because people were more aware of their neighbours than perhaps they had been previously in the last lockdown, that isn't an appropriate thing for volunteers or for local informal co-ops or mutual aids to be managing. But how you link people into local public services like social care and children's services is a question for us. So one of the things I think, as I say, I would love to see the co-op be a hub for people, not running these groups, because the groups should be running themselves and we shouldn't be trying to kind of put a label on it and make it rigid, but being a hub of expertise and also being a hub of people that when those difficult questions, so as an MP at the moment, what happens when that happens is people go, somebody should know something about it, somebody should be able to do something about it. Stella, no, you must, and I'm sure Anna as a councillor, you've had the same experience too. If the co-op became that trusted source of support, I think that could be the structure rather than structuring these groups in themselves. That's also an intently, and I must say this as a politician, political thing to do, because we have to recognise that our communities are having to do this because of the absence of organisation at a national and indeed local level, because of the funding, because of things like austerity. And there's a real parallel here when you ask about 100 years time, you know, that's where the Rochdale pioneers came from. They recognised there was an absence of organisation in their local communities, and rather than sit around and whinge about it and say somebody should do something about it, they did it themselves. I would hope in 100 years' time, we weren't in a position where people were collaborating together and cooperating because of an absence of support for that way of working at a national or a local level, but because they were being empowered to go further faster. So I hope the lesson, God forbid another pandemic comes, is that cooperating works, and rather than trying to contain it, structure it, put it in a cage and sort of manage it that way, we're really good at devolving power and empowering people to collaborate alongside each other. I hope that not just for pandemics, I hope that for public services and for the future of our country, and that to me is what Building Back Better is. But certainly I think the lesson, hopefully moving into the next lockdown, is not to crush people's willingness to work with each other, but to find ways of working around them, because when you do, amazing things happen.
Quite right. And I think you're also quite on the button to point out that co-ops can't only be seen as a response to crisis and not something that's sort of hugely aspirational and a replacement for all of the, we can't say when things are good it's a private business and when things are bad let's find a co-op to pick up the pieces. I think that's really important point to make. I'm going to come back to Paul next, I think. Karen, I'm going to put you last, partly because I think you've got lots of practical things to talk about from Birmingham to end us on a positive note, I hope. Not that you wouldn't be positive, Paul, but you know, when we talk about co-ops existing both as a response to need and crisis, but also existing sort of in a sustainable and long-term way, no one better talked about that than the groups. I thought perhaps you could sort of continue on from Stella's point there.
Yeah, I'm just trying to fight my inner demons of the need for a bit of bureaucracy, but I don't disagree with what Stella says. I think I would come back to, you know, what can we do better? I think the real power of the movement is that it can create an ecosystem. You know, if you go back to days gone by, but even now you have cooperatives cooperating with other cooperatives. You have that ecosystem. It's Principle 6. It's exactly what Joe said at the beginning. And if I'm honest, recognizing that, you know, one size does not fit all, but I certainly think, for example, on the payment for vulnerable customers, I know we had a scheme. I know mid-counties who do great things had a scheme. I know Southern will have had a scheme, East of England. There's got to be, I think there's something about cooperatives, you know, Principle 6, about what are the things that you need a bit of scale to be able to fix. And as long as that scale can be used locally without trying to shoehorn people in. So the kind of challenges that Stella described, I think that's where I think we can do a bit better. I think as cooperatives, I was once told by, when I first joined the co-op group, that this lady who is brilliant said to me, just remember one thing, that at its worst, the cooperative movement doesn't cooperate and it doesn't move. Well, that's the cooperative movement at its worst. At its best, we cooperate with each other, Principle 6, and we fly. And that's the bit I think we can do better going forward, is cooperating better amongst cooperatives. It was what Joe said at the beginning.
Lovely, thank you. And Karen, I'll pass to you to sort of, and we'll finish up after you.
Thank you. It's quite intimidating to go after all of that, because actually I don't disagree with anything, and I found quite a lot of what's been said really inspiring. I suppose if I can turn it into language that I feel resonates in Birmingham, not that that language wouldn't, I don't mean to imply that, but if I think about some of what we're talking about in Birmingham at the moment, there's something about, and Stella talked about it so well, about mental health issues. There's something about people feeling really isolated and needing connection. So I think for me, one of the things that the cooperative movement could do better, not that it isn't trying, but it is that point about networks, and how I would describe that as, you know, making itself really visible as a flock or a tribe that people can join. Because when you're feeling disconnected and when you're feeling isolated, actually it's often that sense of having lost your tribe or your flock. And there are loads and loads of reasons why going through what we've just been going through as a nation really compounds that. And I think ultimately Stella and the others all talked about, in some way, the cooperative movement holding space for the networks that are the cooperative movement in themselves, to kind of know each other better, and therefore to be able to be present when individuals out there want to understand what it means to be within a cooperative, or to work with one, or to receive services. If we get that right, and that point that Stella made really well as well about co-ops not just being there for crisis, if we get that right, then
I think Karen's Wi-Fi might have given up the ghost just at the critical point where she was going to tell us what's happened if we get that right. Karen, are you back?
I can hear you okay. Can you hear
Excellent.
me?
You said if we get that right, and then everything stopped,
Yeah,
and we're all on a cliff edge.
If we get that right, a fairer, more cooperative society or world, actually that promotes that sense of belonging. And that's the bit for me, that people feel like they belong to a cooperative movement. They understand what it means, that they've got people there that they can relate to, and that actually we're not just using it to respond to a crisis. We're using it because that's the better way to live and better way to have our society.
I knew you'd finish us on a positive note. Thank you, Karen. I agree completely. I think what I would say first is a massive thank you to Joe, Stella, Paul and Karen for joining us. I think that's been really uplifting and interesting and inspiring, and I hope that everyone has taken away some ideas about ways in which they can even better champion the co-op movement in their own communities and prepare themselves to play a role as and when we have this second wave and future lockdowns. And I think also I would encourage people, which, you know, as a staff member is my job, to join us tomorrow, because they're hugely practical sessions. At lunchtime, it's called Don't Moan, Organise, which I think echoes sort of some of what Stella was saying around how communities can revitalise their high streets, which have been really hard hit by this crisis. And I know that that's something that, you know, that the group and others have been involved in working with local neighbourhoods. So hopefully building on some of that, and some really exciting examples from Dumfries, who have created a co-op that's taking over the empty shops and doing it for themselves in the absence of anyone else doing it for them. And then in the evening, we are talking about how we make change happen during COVID. So all the ways we'd normally make change happen, knocking on doors, organising meetings, rallies, don't work in a world of social distancing. So we're going to hear from someone who's organised BLM protests, someone who has been running a kitchen through this crisis, and someone, my third speaker, who's also excellent. Oh, a really great guy who started a mutual aid group in rural Yorkshire, talking a bit about how you go about organising people. So if you are new to organising, or all of the things you're used to doing have been pulled out from underneath you, how to go about making change happen and improving your own community will be talked about tomorrow. So please join us if you're inspired, and if you're not, join us and we'll inspire you. So thank you very much. See you all tomorrow, and look after yourselves. Thanks. Bye-bye.